The fluorescent lights of St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital hummed their eternal monotone song, casting everything in that peculiar shade of institutional white that made even the healthiest person look vaguely ill. It was 3 a.m, that sacred hour when the world holds its breath between yesterday and tomorrow, when hospital corridors echo with footsteps that seem louder than they should, and when nurses move through their rounds with the quiet efficiency of ghosts tending to the living. Margaret Chen moved through Ward 7 with precision that would have impressed a drill sergeant. Her white sneakers made no sound against the linoleum floor, her movements economical and exact. She checked each monitor, adjusted each IV drip, and made notations on her tablet with fingers that never fumbled, never hesitated. At 53, she had the bearing of someone who had learned long ago that wasted motion could mean wasted lives. Beds at 45-degree angles, she murmured to herself, adjusting Mrs. Patterson's position with practiced hands. Optimal for respiration, minimal pressure on the lumbar region. Mrs. Patterson, deep in her morphine dreams, didn't stir as Margaret tucked the blanket with corners so crisp they could have cut glass. Behind the nurse's station, 2 younger nurses watched her with barely concealed eye rolls. Jessica, 26 and fresh enough from nursing school that her scrubs still had that new fabric stiffness, leaned toward her colleague Marcus and whispered, "She's doing the bed thing again. I swear if she breaks out a ruler to measure the pillow angles, I'm going to lose it." Marcus stifled a laugh, his dark eyes dancing with shared amusement. "My buddy from County General calls her the General. Says she ran her last ward like a military base. Bed checks, supply inventories, the whole 9 yards. He shook his head. "This is a hospital, not boot camp. Did you hear she rode up Denise last week?" Jessica continued, her voice dropping even lower. "For having a coffee cup at the station. Said it violated protocols." She made air quotes around the last word. "Like seriously? We're pulling 12-hour shifts. We're not asking for much. Just basic human accommodations." They didn't notice that Margaret had paused in her rounds, her hand resting on the rail of Mr. Kim's bed. She'd heard every word. Her hearing was still sharp, trained by years of listening for the subtle change in breathing that meant a soldier was going into shock, the distant whistle that meant incoming mortars, the click of a weapon being readied in the dark. She'd heard it all, and she'd learned to file it away, to build walls around the hurt, because hurt was a luxury she'd never been able to afford. Margaret Chen hadn't always been the iron-spined nurse that St. Catherine's staff loved to mock. There had been a time, though it felt like several lifetimes ago, when she'd been just Maggie, a bright-eyed nursing graduate from Sacramento with dreams of working in pediatrics, of spending her days making sick children smile, of going home each evening to a quiet apartment where the loudest sound was her kettle whistling for tea. But that was before the recruiter had come to her graduation ceremony, before she'd signed papers that redirected the entire course of her life, before she'd found herself on a transport plane, heading toward a desert that seemed to stretch beyond the edges of the world. That was before she'd learned that nursing wasn't always about comfort and healing. Sometimes it was about triage, about making impossible choices, about holding someone's hand while they died because there simply wasn't time to save them and the 3 others who still had a chance. She'd been deployed to Forward, operating Base Falcon outside Baghdad in 2006. Fresh-faced and terrified, but determined not to show it. The heat had hit her like a physical blow when she'd stepped off the plane. A dry, scorching heat that sucked the moisture from your lungs and made you understand why ancient peoples had thought of deserts as places where demons dwelled. The noise was constant. Helicopters, generators, distant explosions that her new colleagues learned to gauge by sound alone. That's just a controlled detonation. That's outgoing artillery. That's too close. Get down. She'd arrived expecting to work in a proper field hospital, but FOB Falcon's medical facilities were a collection of reinforced tents and makeshift structures that shook with every explosion. Her commanding officer, Colonel Sarah Vance, had taken one look at her pristine uniform and optimistic expression and said, "You've got kind eyes, Lieutenant Chen. That's good for peacetime. Out here, you're going to need to find something harder inside yourself, or you won't make it 3 months." Margaret hadn't understood what she meant. Not then. The understanding came 3 days later when the casualties started pouring in from an IED attack on a convoy. She'd been trained for mass casualties in theory, had practiced on dummies and simulations, but nothing prepared you for the reality, the blood, the screaming, The way a 19-year-old boy could look at you with eyes that still held all his hopes and dreams while his body was too destroyed to sustain them. "Chen," Colonel Vance had barked across the chaos. "Left side now. You've got the 3 criticals. Move!" Margaret had frozen. Just for a second. But a second was an eternity when lives hung in the balance. 3 critical patients. She could see them all. A young woman, barely 20, with a sucking chest wound. A man whose leg was attached by threads of tissue. Another whose face was a mask of blood. She could save maybe 2 of them if she moved fast, made the right choices, didn't let her hands shake or her mind falter. "Chen," Vance's voice cut through her paralysis. "You don't have time to feel. You have time to work. Choose and move." Something had crystallized in Margaret in that moment, something cold and clear and unbreakable. She'd moved. She'd chosen. She'd worked with hands that didn't shake, and a mind that calculated odds instead of dwelling on horror. When it was over, when the tent finally quieted and she could step outside into the brutal sunshine, she'd walked behind the supply containers and vomited until there was nothing left inside her but that cold, clear thing that had kept her moving. Colonel Vance had found her there, had handed her a bottle of water without a word. They'd stood together in the shadow of the containers, and finally Vance had spoken. "The first time is the hardest. You'll never forget them, the ones you save and the ones you can't. But if you let it break you, you're no good to anyone. So you build walls, you create systems. You follow protocols because protocols are what keep you standing when everything else wants to drag you down." Margaret had nodded, unable to speak, and something unspoken had passed between them. A recognition, a kinship, an understanding that some bonds are forged in fire and blood and cannot be broken. She'd spent 14 months at FOB Falcon, and every day had taught her new lessons about efficiency, about the critical importance of order in the face of chaos, about how a misplaced instrument or a moment of disorganization could mean the difference between life and death. She'd learned to speak in crisp, clear commands. She'd learned to move with purpose. She'd learned that emotion was something you filed away for later, for when you were alone and could afford to fall apart. And she'd learned to train others. Young medics had rotated through constantly, kids fresh, from training who thought they knew what they were getting into until they saw their first trauma. Margaret had become known for her rigorous standards, her insistence on perfect protocol, her absolute intolerance for carelessness. Some had resented her. Most had initially feared her. But they'd all learned from her. And more importantly, they'd survived because of her. "Chen's a hard ass," she'd overheard one young corpsman tell another. "But I'd rather have her training me than anyone else. She'll ride you until you hate her. But when the shit hits the fan, you'll know exactly what to do. And that's when you'll realize she saved your life before you even knew you were in danger." The words had meant more to her than any commendation. Now, years later and thousands of miles from that desert, Margaret finished her rounds and returned to the nurses' station. Jessica and Marcus had moved on to discussing weekend plans, their earlier mockery apparently forgotten. Margaret sat down at her computer terminal and began her reports, her fingers flying across the keyboard with the same precision she brought to everything else. She didn't explain herself. She never did. How could she make them understand that every perfectly aligned bed, every meticulously organized supply cart, every protocol followed to the letter was her way of honoring the lessons she'd learned in that terrible, transformative desert? How could she explain that she saw the potential for disaster in every deviation from standard procedure because she'd seen what happened when things went wrong in the worst possible ways? She couldn't. So she stayed silent and did her work, and let them call her the general behind her back. It was easier that way. The shift change came at 7 in the morning, bringing with it the day crew and the familiar chaos of breakfast service and doctor's rounds. Margaret gave her report to the incoming charge nurse, gathered her things, and headed for the elevator. She was almost there when she heard the whispers. "I'm telling you, she's absolutely unbearable," a voice was saying from the break room. The door was slightly ajar. "She sent back my supply request 3 times. 3 times. Because I didn't format it correctly. It's a request for gauze, not a dissertation. She made me redo an entire IV setup last week," another voice chimed in. "Said the tape job was sloppy. The patient was fine. The IV was working. But no, it had to meet her military specifications or whatever." Margaret kept walking. The elevator doors opened, and she stepped inside, watching the hospital fall away as she descended. Her reflection stared back at her from the polished steel doors, a woman with silver streaking her black hair, lines around her eyes that came from too many years of squinting against desert sun and harsh fluorescent lights, a mouth that had forgotten how to curve into an easy smile. She wondered sometimes if she'd become too hard, too rigid, if maybe the walls she'd built to survive had become a prison. But then she'd remember a young soldier's face, remember the ones who'd lived because she'd insisted on proper technique, proper protocol, proper discipline, and she'd push the doubt away. The parking lot was nearly full, day shift arriving as night shift departed in the eternal cycle of hospital life. Margaret walked to her sensible gray Honda, the kind of car that blended into traffic and required minimal maintenance. She was unlocking the door when her phone buzzed. The message was from an unknown number. "Margaret Chen? This is Colonel Sarah Vance. I hope this message finds you well. I'm going to be in your area next month for a military medical conference. I'd very much like to see you again if you're available. I have something important to discuss with you." Margaret stared at the screen for a long moment, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. Sarah Vance. She hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in years, though it lived in her memory as vividly as yesterday. The colonel had been her commanding officer, her mentor, the woman who'd shown her how to transform fear into precision, chaos into order, helplessness into purpose. She typed back, "Colonel Vance. Yes. I'd be honored to meet with you. Please let me know when and where." The reply came almost immediately. "Next Thursday. I'll come to your hospital if that works. I understand you're still saving lives, just in a different uniform now." Margaret smiled, a rare, genuine expression that transformed her face. "That works perfectly. I look forward to seeing you again." She sat in her car for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, staring at nothing. Sarah Vance was coming here, to St. Catharines, after all these years. The thought brought a strange mixture of anticipation and anxiety. What could she possibly have to discuss that was so important? The week that followed was routine in the way that hospital weeks were routine, which was to say, controlled chaos punctuated by moments of genuine crisis. Margaret navigated it all with her characteristic precision, seemingly unaware of the continued whispers and eye rolls that followed her through the corridors. On Tuesday, she had a run-in with Dr. Morrison, the new head of the surgical department. He'd left his post-operative notes incomplete, and Margaret had paged him at 2 a.m. to complete them before shift change. "For God's sake. Nurse Chen," he'd snapped when he arrived, tie askew and coffee in hand. "The notes can wait until morning rounds." "No, doctor, they cannot." Margaret's voice was calm but unyielding. "Post-operative complications can develop rapidly. The next shift needs complete information to provide adequate care. This is standard protocol." "Standard protocol," he'd repeated mockingly. "You know what? I've heard about you. The army nurse who thinks she's still deployed. This isn't a war zone. And I'm not one of your subordinates." Margaret had met his eyes steadily. "No, Dr. Morrison, this isn't a war zone. It's a hospital, and if we don't maintain standards here, where lives are equally at stake, then we're failing in our fundamental duty. I'm not asking you to do anything extraordinary. I'm asking you to do your job completely." He'd finished the notes, but the encounter had made the rounds by morning. Margaret heard the whispers. She actually called out Morrison in the middle of the night. Can you believe her? Someone needs to report her to administration. Jessica had been particularly vocal. "She's going to get someone in real trouble one of these days," she told Marcus at the nurse's station, not bothering to lower her voice. Morrison was furious. "He's talking about filing a complaint." "Maybe someone should talk to her," Marcus had suggested, though he didn't sound enthusiastic about volunteering. Like, explain that this isn't how things work in the civilian world? Good luck with that. I think she's physically incapable of accepting feedback. It's her way or the highway. Margaret, checking medication logs 3 feet away, said nothing. What was there to say? That Dr. Morrison's incomplete notes would have meant the night nurse wouldn't have known about the patient's penicillin allergy. That the unnecessary protocol had actually prevented a potentially fatal medication error? They wouldn't hear it. They'd just see another example of the army nurse being unreasonably strict. Thursday arrived gray and cold. Typical November weather for upstate New York. Margaret was in the middle of her shift, reviewing the day's schedule, when she received a call from the hospital administrator's office. Ms. Chen? The secretary's voice was crisp and professional. Mr. Harrison would like to see you in his office at 2 o'clock this afternoon. He said it's important. Margaret's heart sank slightly. A summons to administration was rarely good news. I'll be there, she said simply. She spent the next few hours running through possibilities. Morrison's complaint, probably, or maybe a formal reprimand about her management style. She'd been through it before at other hospitals. Eventually, she always moved on, finding a new place that tolerated her methods until they didn't. And then the cycle would repeat. At exactly 2 o'clock, she presented herself at the administrative offices. Mr. Harrison's secretary showed her into a conference room rather than his personal office, which was unusual. The room was empty except for Harrison himself, standing by the window with his back to her. Ms. Chen, thank you for coming. He turned, and his expression was unreadable. Please sit down. We're waiting for one more person. Before Margaret could ask who, the door opened again, and a figure in army dress uniform entered the room. Margaret's breath caught. Colonel Sarah Vance looked exactly as Margaret remembered. Tall, slim, with steel gray hair cut in a practical style, and eyes that missed nothing. She wore her rank insignia with the same pride Margaret remembered, her uniform immaculate, her bearing that of someone who commanded respect without demanding it. Margaret, Vance said, and her stern face broke into a warm smile. It's good to see you again. Margaret found herself standing without conscious decision, years of military training snapping her spine straight. Colonel Vance, I didn't expect you until later today. Change of plans. I hope you don't mind that I came early. I wanted to speak with Mr. Harrison first. Vance turned to the administrator. Thank you for accommodating my request on such short notice. Harrison nodded, looking between the two women with undisguised curiosity. Of course, Colonel. Though I'll admit, your call yesterday was unexpected. You said you had information about Ms. Chen that I should hear? Margaret's confusion must have shown on her face, because Vance smiled again, this time with a hint of mischief that was entirely new. Margaret, I'm here because I've been hearing things. Your name has come up several times in military medical circles recently. My name? Margaret echoed, bewildered. I haven't had contact with the military medical community in years. No, but they've had contact with your work. Vance pulled a folder from her briefcase and set it on the conference table. Tell me, how many nurses have you trained since you left active duty? Give me a rough estimate. Margaret blinked at the unexpected question. I don't know. I've been at 6 different hospitals over the years. I work with new nurses regularly. Maybe 100? 150? 163, Vance said crisply. I counted. Do you know how many of those nurses went on to join the military medical corps? No, 47. Nearly a third. Vance opened the folder, revealing what looked like personnel files. Do you know Captain James Martinez? Margaret searched her memory. Martinez. Yes. Young man, very bright. Worked with me at County General about 5 years ago. Wanted to be a trauma nurse. He's currently deployed in Afghanistan, running the emergency department at Kandahar Airfield. Saved 43 lives last month during a mass casualty event. Vance pulled out another file. Lieutenant Sarah Okonkwo? Sarah. Yes, I remember her. She worked here at St. Catherine's for a year before she left. She's a flight nurse now, doing medical evacuations. She specifically requested that assignment. Says you taught her how to work in high-stress situations with limited resources. Another file. Sergeant Peter Kim, Corpsman First Class David Rivera, Lieutenant Commander Michelle Tasker. Do any of these names sound familiar? Margaret's mind was reeling. Yes, I worked with all of them, but I don't understand what... They all cited you as their primary inspiration for joining military medical services. Vance interrupted. And more than that, they all credited your training with saving lives in the field. Martinez wrote a letter to the Army Medical Department, it's in here, specifically praising the protocols you taught him. He said, and I quote, Nurse Chen's insistence on perfect technique and unwavering adherence to standards seemed excessive in a civilian hospital. But in a combat zone, those same standards are the difference between life and death. Every soldier who walked out of my facility alive last month owed their lives to the foundation she built in me. The room was very quiet. Margaret felt something unfamiliar welling up in her chest, something warm and uncomfortable and dangerously close to tears. She pushed it down firmly. That's very kind of him to say. It's not kindness, Margaret. It's truth. Vance pulled out more papers. I have 17 letters like this. 17 former nurses and medics who worked with you, learned from you, and went on to serve. They're all saying the same thing, that your training, your standards, your protocols saved lives when it mattered most. Mr. Harrison was leaning forward, his earlier wariness replaced by intent interest. Colonel, I'm beginning to understand why you wanted this meeting. I received a call last week, Vance continued, addressing Harrison but keeping her eyes on Margaret. From a colleague in medical command. He'd been reviewing training protocols for our field hospitals, trying to understand why certain units had significantly better outcomes than others. He found a pattern. Medics who had worked under Margaret Chen in civilian hospitals before enlisting showed markedly superior performance in high-stress situations. Better adherence to protocol, better organizational skills, better efficiency under pressure. They wanted to know who was training these people so well. And you told them it was our Ms. Chen, Harrison said slowly. I told them it was Margaret Chen, the finest combat nurse I ever had the privilege of serving with. A woman who learned to build systems that save lives under the worst possible conditions, and who never stopped teaching those systems even after she left active duty. Vance finally looked away from Margaret to address Harrison directly. Mr. Harrison, I understand that Ms. Chen has been the subject of some complaints. Harrison had the grace to look uncomfortable. There have been some concerns raised about her management approach. Some staff feel she can be overly rigid. Overly rigid, Vance repeated, and there was steel in her voice now. Let me tell you about rigid, Mr. Harrison. In 2007, FOB Falcon came under sustained attack. We took 15 critical casualties in under an hour. Our medical staff were overwhelmed, supplies were running low, and we had wounded scattered across 3 different locations. Lieutenant Chen, as she was then, organized a triage system in the middle of incoming fire. She designated areas, assigned personnel, and coordinated care with such precision that we didn't lose a single patient that should have survived. Her rigid protocols meant that in the chaos, everyone knew exactly what to do and where to be. She pulled out a photograph. A younger Margaret in desert camouflage, standing beside a row of soldiers with bandaged limbs and tired smiles. These men are alive because Margaret Chen was overly rigid, because she insisted on perfect technique, because she wouldn't tolerate shortcuts or sloppiness, because she understood that in medicine the details matter. Margaret stared at the photograph. She barely remembered it being taken. It had been during a rare moment of peace, after a successful surgery, when someone had insisted on documenting the recovery ward's success. She looked so young in it, so serious, with that same ramrod straight posture she still maintained. I'm not here to tell you how to run your hospital, Vance continued, but I am here to tell you who Margaret Chen is, because I don't think your staff knows, and I think they should. Harrison was quiet for a long moment, studying the papers spread across the table. Letters, commendations, photos, statistics. Finally, he looked at Margaret. Ms. Chen, I'll admit I called you here today because I was considering whether we needed to have a conversation about your future at St. Catherine's. Several staff members have complained about your methods. Dr. Morrison filed a formal grievance. I thought perhaps you were simply a poor fit for our culture. Margaret nodded slowly. She'd heard variations of this speech before. This was usually when they asked her to resign, to find somewhere else where her particular skills might be better appreciated. But Harrison surprised her. I was wrong to consider that without understanding the full picture. Colonel Vance has given me a lot to think about, but I'd like to hear from you. Why do you do things the way you do? It was the first time anyone had asked, really asked, with genuine interest rather than criticism. Margaret took a breath, gathering her thoughts. Because I've seen what happens when protocols aren't followed. I've held instruments while a surgeon operates by flashlight because the power's out. I've run a code with mortars falling 50 feet away. I've had to choose which patient gets the last unit of O-negative blood. And in all of those situations, the only thing that kept people alive was training. Discipline. Systems that work even when everything else is falling apart. She looked down at her hands. They were steady, as always. I know the other nurses think I'm too strict. They think I'm a relic, that I don't understand how civilian hospitals work. But every time I see a supply cart left in disarray, I remember running out of critical supplies mid-surgery. Every time I see sloppy documentation, I remember a patient who nearly received the wrong medication because information wasn't properly communicated. Every time I see someone cutting corners because they're tired or busy, I remember all the people who died because someone cut a corner at the wrong time. Her voice didn't waver, but something in her expression softened. I don't enjoy being disliked. I'm not trying to make people's jobs harder, but I made a promise to myself and to every patient I've ever cared for that I would never let standards slip. Not on my watch, even if it means being called the general behind my back, even if it means people think I'm difficult or unreasonable, because the alternative, the cost of not being vigilant, is too high. The room was silent. Harrison and Vance exchanged a glance, some unspoken communication passing between them. Margaret, Vance said gently, when I served with you, you were one of the most respected nurses in the unit. Not just by me, but by everyone who worked with you. Yes, you were demanding. Yes, you held people to high standards, but they respected you, because they knew every demand came from a place of genuine care for their survival and for the patients. What happened? Why are things different here? Margaret considered the question carefully. In the military, people understand the stakes immediately. They see the consequences of failure right in front of them. In a civilian hospital, the stakes are just as high, but they're less obvious. People can work for years without seeing what happens when systems fail catastrophically. They think rigid protocols are unnecessary, because they haven't experienced the alternative. She paused, searching for the right words. I never learned how to explain it without sounding like I'm talking down to them. So I just enforce the standards and accept that they'll resent me for it. That's gonna change, Harrison said firmly. Starting today. He stood up, gathering the papers. Colonel Vance, would you be willing to stay for a few more hours? I'd like to call an emergency staff meeting. That's exactly why I cleared my schedule, Vance replied with a small smile. 2 hours later, the conference room was crowded with nurses, doctors, and medical staff from across the hospital. The announcement had been sudden enough that rumors were flying. Someone was being fired. The hospital was being sold. There was a major policy change coming. People filed in with expressions ranging from curious to anxious. Jessica and Marcus found seats near the back, whispering to each other. This has to be about Chen, Jessica muttered. Maybe Morrison's complaint finally got through to administration. Or maybe she's being promoted, Marcus joked, though his tone suggested he didn't think that was likely. Imagine her as head nurse. We'd all be doing jumping jacks at shift change. Dr. Morrison stood near the front, arms crossed, wearing an expression of vindicated smugness. Several other senior staff members who'd had run-ins with Margaret over the years wore similar expressions. Finally, something was going to be done about the army nurse and her impossible standards. Margaret herself stood to the side, her face carefully neutral. She'd learned long ago not to show emotion in situations like this. Whatever was coming, she'd face it with the same composure she'd maintained through everything else. Mr. Harrison entered, followed by Colonel Vance in her dress uniform. The sight of a military officer in full regalia immediately quieted the room. It was unexpected, dramatic, and clearly significant, though no one quite knew why. Thank you all for coming on such short notice, Harrison began. I know this is unusual, but Colonel Sarah Vance has information that I believe you all need to hear. It concerns one of our nurses, Margaret Chen. He gestured to Margaret, and every eye in the room turned to her. Many of you know her. Some of you have worked with her, and I understand that some of you have found her management style challenging. There were murmurs of agreement, some uncomfortable shifting. Jessica and Marcus exchanged glances. Before we go any further with assessing Ms. Chen's performance, Harrison continued, I think it's important that you understand who she is and where her methods come from. Colonel Vance served with Margaret in Iraq and has some context that will help you appreciate your colleague better. Colonel? Vance stepped forward, her bearing commanding immediate attention. She was a woman who didn't need to raise her voice to fill a room. Decades of command had given her a presence that demanded respect. Thank you, Mr. Harrison. I won't take much of your time. I know you all have patients to return to, but I want to tell you a story." She pulled out the photograph of young Margaret in the desert. This is Lieutenant Margaret Chen in 2007 at Forward Operating Base Falcon in Iraq. She was 29 years old, fresh out of nursing school, and she'd volunteered to deploy because she wanted to serve. She thought she was going to work in a field hospital. Instead, she ended up in a combat zone where the medical facilities were tents and shipping containers, where we operated during mortar attacks, where we sometimes had to choose which patients we could save because we didn't have the resources to save everyone. The room was absolutely silent now. Several people were leaning forward, focused entirely on Vance's words. Lieutenant Chen became one of the finest combat nurses I ever had the privilege to serve with. She didn't get there by being soft or flexible or easygoing. She got there by being absolutely uncompromisingly rigorous. Because in a combat zone, there's no margin for error, no second chances, no opportunity to go back and fix a mistake. You get it right the first time, or people die. It's that simple and that brutal. Vance began walking slowly through the room, making eye contact with different staff members. "I heard that some of you call her the General, that you mock her insistence on precise protocols, that you think she's too rigid, too strict, too demanding, that you filed complaints about her management style." Her eyes found Dr. Morrison. "I heard that one." Doctor felt she was overstepping her bounds by insisting on complete post-operative documentation. In the middle of the night, Morrison shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. "Let me tell you what Margaret Chen's rigid protocols have accomplished." In 14 months of combat deployment, the medical unit she helped run had a mortality rate 15% lower than comparable facilities. 15%! Do you understand what that means? That's dozens of lives saved because someone insisted on perfect technique, complete documentation, and unwavering adherence to standards. She pulled out the stack of letters. After she left active duty, Margaret worked in civilian hospitals. Some of the nurses and medics she trained went on to enlist in military medical services. I have 47 documented cases, and those 47 people have collectively saved hundreds of lives in combat zones around the world, using the protocols and techniques that Margaret Chen taught them in civilian hospitals. Hospitals like this one. Vance's voice took on a harder edge. "So when you complain that she's too strict about supply organization, understand that she's remembering the day we ran out of critical supplies during a mass casualty event and had to make impossible choices. When you roll your eyes at her insistence on perfect bed positioning, understand that she's remembering soldiers whose lives were saved or lost based on such details. When you mock her for requiring complete documentation, understand that she's remembering the patient who nearly died because information wasn't properly communicated between shifts." She returned to the front of the room, standing beside Margaret now. "Margaret Chen is teaching you to work as if lives depend on your precision and your discipline, because they do. They always do, whether you're in a combat zone or a civilian hospital. The stakes are exactly the same. Someone's father, someone's daughter, someone's loved one is depending on you to get it right. And Margaret knows from hard experience what happens when you don't." The silence in the room was profound. Jessica felt her face burning with shame as she remembered every eye roll, every mocking comment, every time she'd complained about the Army nurses' impossible standards. Beside her, Marcus was staring at his hands. Dr. Morrison no longer looked smug. He looked like a man who'd just realized he'd been standing on a pedestal to shout at someone he should have been looking up to. "Now," Vance continued, her tone softening slightly, "I'm not here to tell you that Margaret is perfect. She'd be the first to tell you she can be difficult to work with. Combat nursing teaches you to prioritize efficiency over diplomacy, results over relationships. Margaret brought home skills that save lives, but she also brought home walls, protective mechanisms that kept her functioning in impossible situations, but that can make her seem cold or unapproachable here." She glanced at Margaret, who was still standing with that same neutral expression, though something in her eyes suggested she was hearing herself described in ways she'd never quite articulated. "What I want you to understand is that every rigid protocol, every exacting standard, every seemingly unnecessary requirement comes from a place of profound care. Margaret isn't strict because she's on a power trip or because she enjoys making your jobs harder. She's strict because she knows, has seen firsthand, has lived through what happens when standards slip. And she cares too much about her patients and her colleagues to let that happen on her watch." Vance pulled out one final paper. "This is a letter from Captain James Martinez, one of the nurses Margaret trained. He's currently deployed in Afghanistan. He wrote, "Nurse Chen was the most demanding instructor I ever had. I sometimes resented her constant corrections, her insistence that there was only one right way to do things. But when I found myself treating casualties in a forward operating base with limited supplies and constant time pressure, I understood. Every technique she drilled into me, every protocol she made me practice until it was automatic, every standard she refused to let me compromise on, those things saved lives. I think of her every time I work, and I'm grateful for every moment of her difficult teaching. She gave me the tools to function when chaos tried to overwhelm me. She taught me that discipline and care are not opposite. They're the same thing." Vance looked around the room. That's who Margaret Chen is. A nurse who understands that true compassion sometimes looks like strictness. That kindness sometimes means holding people to standards they don't think they can meet, because meeting those standards is what will keep their patients alive. She's been doing the hard, thankless work of maintaining excellence in an environment where most people don't understand why it matters. And instead of being appreciated for that, she's been mocked and resented. She let that sink in for a moment before concluding, "I'm not asking you to love her methods. I'm not asking you to suddenly find her easy to work with. I'm asking you to respect her expertise, to understand where her standards come from, and to consider that maybe, just maybe, the Army nurse knows what she's doing." Mr. Harrison stepped forward again. "Thank you, Colonel Vance. That was illuminating." He turned to address the assembled staff. "I called this meeting because I was prepared to have a conversation about Ms. Chen's future here. Several of you had expressed concerns about her management style, and I took those concerns seriously. But after speaking with Colonel Vance, I realized I was viewing the situation entirely wrong." He looked directly at Margaret. "Ms. Chen, I apologize. This hospital has been fortunate to have you, and instead of recognizing that, we've treated you as a problem to be managed. That changes today." He turned back to the room. "Effective immediately, I'm creating a new position, Director of Clinical Standards and Training. Margaret Chen will be taking that role. She will be responsible for developing and implementing training protocols for all nursing staff, with a focus on emergency preparedness and high-stress medical situations. She will also be leading our new partnership with the Veterans Affairs Hospital system to provide training for medical personnel who may be considering military service." The announcement landed like a thunderclap. Jessica felt her stomach drop. Marcus looked stunned. Even Dr. Morrison seemed taken aback. Harrison wasn't finished. "Additionally, I'm mandating that all senior staff, doctors and nurses alike, complete a 2-week intensive training program that Ms. Chen will design, focusing on the protocols and standards that have proven so effective in combat medicine. If these methods are good enough to save lives in war zones, they're certainly good enough for St. Catherine's." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I want to be clear, this is not optional. This is not a suggestion. Our hospital will be better for embracing these standards, and our patients will be safer. Ms. Chen has been trying to give us a gift, the benefit of her hard-won expertise, and we've been too short-sighted to accept it. That ends now." Vance stepped forward again. "I'd like to add one more thing. The Army Medical Department is launching a new civilian military training exchange program. We want to send military medical personnel to civilian hospitals for training, and we want civilian medical personnel to understand military medical protocols. Margaret, if you're willing, we'd like St. Catherine's to be one of our pilot locations, with you leading the program." For the first time since the meeting began, Margaret's composure cracked slightly. Her eyes widened, and something that might have been emotion flickered across her face before she controlled it. Colonel, that would be an honor." "The honor is ours, Lieutenant Chen." Vance smiled, using Margaret's old military rank with obvious affection. "You never stopped serving. You just changed uniforms." Harrison dismissed the meeting, and people filed out slowly, quietly, many of them stealing glances at Margaret as they passed. The easy mockery was gone, replaced by something more complex. Shame, respect, curiosity, a desire to understand what they'd been too quick to judge. Jessica approached Margaret hesitantly, Marcus trailing behind her. "Ms. Chen, I need to apologize. I've said some terrible things about you. Behind your back mostly, but that doesn't make it better. I didn't understand. I'm sorry." Margaret studied the young nurse for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then, surprisingly, she smiled. A small, genuine expression that transformed her face. "You're young, Jessica. You haven't seen the worst that medicine can throw at you yet. I hope you never have to see it the way I did. But when you do face a true crisis, and you will eventually, you'll understand why I push so hard. Not because I enjoy being difficult, but because I want you to survive it. I want you to have the tools you need to save lives when it matters most." "I'd like to learn," Jessica said quietly. "Really learn. Not just comply because I have to, but understand why it matters. Then we'll start Monday." Margaret's tone was brisk, professional. But there was something warmer underneath now. A willingness to engage, to teach, to bridge the gap that had existed between her and her colleagues. "Bring your questions. I'll bring my answers. Fair enough?" Jessica nodded, relief flooding her face. Marcus echoed the sentiment, and they left together, talking quietly about what they'd just learned. Dr. Morrison approached next, and his discomfort was obvious. "Nurse Chen, Ms. Chen, I owe you an apology as well. A significant one. I filed a formal complaint about you, and I was wrong to do so. Your correction was appropriate. I was tired and irritable, and I took it out on you instead of recognizing that you were protecting my patient." Margaret regarded him steadily. "Dr. Morrison, I could have handled that interaction better. I tend to be blunt when I should be diplomatic. But the core message stands. Complete documentation saves lives. I'm glad we understand each other now." He nodded, looking relieved. "If you're designing training protocols, I'd like to be involved. I think I could learn a great deal from your experience. I'll take you up on that." As Morrison left, the room gradually emptied until only Margaret, Vance, and Harrison remained. Harrison excused himself. "I need to start working on the logistics of your new position." Ms. Chen, leaving the two former combat nurses alone. Vance sat down heavily in one of the conference room chairs. And suddenly she looked tired. The kind of tired that came from years of service, of making impossible decisions, of carrying the weight of lives saved and lost. "Margaret, I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you years ago." Margaret sat down across from her, waiting. "When you left the service, I thought I'd failed you." Vance's voice was quiet, almost vulnerable, so different from her commanding tone during the meeting. "You were one of my best nurses, and I could see that the deployment had changed you. Made you harder, more closed off. You'd built these walls to survive, and I worried that they'd become your prison. I wrote you a recommendation letter, but I never followed up. Never checked to see how you were adjusting to civilian life. Never reached out to see if you needed support." She looked down at her hands. "I heard rumors over the years, that you moved from hospital to hospital, that you had trouble fitting in, that people found you difficult. And I felt guilty because I thought maybe I'd shaped you into something that couldn't exist outside of a combat zone, that I'd taken a compassionate nurse and turned her into a machine." "Sarah," Margaret started, but Vance held up a hand. "Let me finish. When I started getting these letters from military medical personnel talking about this incredible civilian nurse who'd trained them, I didn't realize at first it was you. Not until someone mentioned your name and your service history. And then I started digging, and I found 47 nurses and medics who'd worked with you and then enlisted. 47 people who credited you with giving them the skills and mindset they needed to save lives in combat zones." Vance's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Margaret, you weren't broken by what we went through. You were forged. And you've spent the last decade doing exactly what you always wanted to do. Saving lives and teaching others to save lives. You just found a different way to do it. A harder way, maybe, but an important one. And I'm so proud of you." Now it was Margaret's turn to feel her carefully maintained composure crumbling. The walls she'd built so carefully, the ones that kept her standing when everything else wanted to drag her down, suddenly felt less necessary. Less like protection and more like isolation. "I thought I'd lost myself over there," she admitted quietly. "The person I was before deployment, Maggie, who wanted to work in pediatrics and go home to quiet evenings. She didn't come back. I tried to mourn her, but mostly I just accepted that this was who I was now. Someone rigid and cold and difficult. Someone people tolerated but didn't particularly like." "You're not cold, Margaret. You're careful. There's a difference." Vance reached across the table and took her hand, a gesture that would have been unthinkable during their deployment, when they'd both maintained strict professional boundaries. You care so much that you can't afford to let it show. Because if you let yourself feel everything you want to feel, you'd be overwhelmed. So you channel it into action, into protocols and standards and training, into making sure that no one dies from a preventable mistake on your watch. Margaret felt something inside her crack open, something that had been sealed tight for years. I see them sometimes, you know, the ones we lost. I'm doing rounds at 3 a.m, and I'll check on a patient, and for just a second I'll see one of them instead, a soldier we couldn't save. And I think, not again, not on my watch, not ever again. I know, Vance said softly. I see them too. That's the price we paid for serving. We carry them with us. But Margaret, you need to remember the ones we saved too. The hundreds of soldiers who lived because you were there. The nurses you trained who went on to save hundreds more. The patients in this hospital who received better care because you refused to let standards slip. They sat in silence for a moment. 2 women who'd been shaped by fire and blood, who'd learned to transform horror into precision, chaos into order, helplessness into purpose. What happens now? Margaret asked finally. Vance smiled. Now you stop being an island. You let these people learn from you. Really learn from you. Not just the protocols, but the why behind them. You share your story. You let them see that strict standards and deep compassion aren't opposites. They're the same thing expressed differently. I don't know if I know how to do that. You'll learn. The same way you learned everything else. By doing it, one day at a time, until it becomes natural. Vance stood up, pulling Margaret up with her. And you won't be doing it alone. I meant what I said about the training exchange program. I'll be here regularly. We'll build something together, something that honors what we learned in that desert and helps others benefit from it without having to experience the same trauma. Margaret felt something unfamiliar, stirring in her chest. Hope, maybe, or possibility. The sense that she might be able to build bridges instead of walls, that she could share her expertise without sacrificing the standards that had kept so many people alive. Thank you, she said simply, for understanding, for not giving up on me. Never, Vance replied firmly. We made it through worse together. This is just a different kind of battle. The weeks that followed transformed St. Catherine's in ways no one had anticipated. Margaret's new role as Director of Clinical Standards and Training gave her the authority to implement changes she'd only dreamed of before. But more importantly, it gave her a platform to explain the reasoning behind her methods. She started with small training sessions, gathering groups of nurses and walking them through specific protocols. But instead of just dictating procedures, she told stories. She described the mass casualty event where proper triage organization saved 15 lives. She explained the medication error that almost killed a soldier because documentation was incomplete. She shared the lessons learned from years of working in conditions where there was no margin for error. Jessica attended every session, taking notes furiously. She discovered that behind every rigid protocol was a story, often a tragic one, that explained exactly why it mattered. The 45-degree bed angle wasn't arbitrary perfectionism. It was optimal positioning to prevent aspiration in unconscious patients, learned from a soldier who died because his airway wasn't properly maintained. The supply cart organization wasn't obsessive neatness. It was a system designed so that in an emergency, anyone could find critical items in seconds without having to search. It's like learning a new language, Jessica told Marcus one evening. Before I just saw rules, now I see reasons. Every standard exists because someone, somewhere died or nearly died without it. It makes everything feel more purposeful. Marcus nodded. He'd been equally transformed by the training. I used to think she was just a control freak. Now I realize she's trying to give us the benefit of her experience without making us go through the trauma that taught her these lessons. That's actually really generous when you think about it. Dr. Morrison became one of Margaret's most unlikely allies. After completing the intensive training program, he sought her out for advice on improving surgical department protocols. You were right about the documentation, he admitted. We've implemented your system, and we've already caught 2 potential medication errors that would have been missed under the old system. I owe you an apology not just for filing that complaint, but for not listening to your expertise sooner. The military-civilian training exchange program launched 3 months after Vance's visit. Military medics rotated through St. Catherine's to learn civilian trauma procedures, while civilian nurses attended workshops on combat casualty care. Margaret found herself teaching classes to packed rooms, No longer the isolated figure enforcing unpopular standards, but a respected instructor sharing hard-won wisdom. One of her students was a young Army medic named Carlos Reyes, fresh from basic training and preparing for his first deployment. He approached her after a particularly intense session on emergency airway management. "Ma'am, can I ask you something? How do you deal with knowing that not everyone makes it? That sometimes you do everything right and it's still not enough?" Margaret saw herself in him. Young, idealistic, not yet hardened by experience, but already worried about the weight he'd soon carry. She took a breath before answering, choosing her words carefully. "You don't deal with it. Not really. You carry it. Every patient you lose becomes part of you. But here's what I learned. You honor them by getting better. By learning from every case, successful or not. By making sure that the next time you face a similar situation, you're a little bit more prepared, a little bit more skilled, a little bit more likely to save the next one." She paused, remembering the faces she still saw in the quiet hours. "And you remember that for every one you lose, there are dozens you save. Focus on those. Let them fuel you, not the failures." Carlos nodded slowly. "Did you ever think about quitting? After a really bad day? Did you ever want to walk away?" "Every single day at first," Margaret admitted. "But then I'd think about all the people who'd still need help tomorrow. All the nurses and medics who'd benefit from what I could teach them, and I'd realize that walking away meant all those losses would be for nothing. So I stayed. I kept working. I kept teaching. And slowly, it got easier to focus on the lives saved, rather than the lives lost." "That's what I want to do," Carlos said quietly. "Save lives, make a difference. I just hope I'm strong enough." Margaret smiled. "The fact that you're worried about it means you will be. The ones who fail are usually the ones who are too confident to be careful. Stay humble, stay vigilant, and remember that every protocol exists for a reason. You'll do fine." After Carlos left, Margaret sat alone in the empty training room, surrounded by mannequins and medical equipment. She thought about the young nurse she'd been 20 years ago, fresh-faced and optimistic, boarding that transport plane to Iraq. She thought about the hardened lieutenant she'd become, learning to build walls to survive the unbearable. She thought about the isolated nurse she'd been for years afterward, moving from hospital to hospital, tolerated, but never truly accepted. And she thought about who she was becoming now, still strict, still demanding, but no longer isolated. Still maintaining high standards, but now helping others understand why they mattered. Still carrying the weight of every life lost, but also celebrating every life saved and every nurse trained to save more. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sarah Vance. "Heard from Captain Martinez today. He's recommending 3 of his subordinates for your next civilian training rotation. Says they need to learn from the best damn combat nurse he's ever known." Thought you'd want to know you're building a legacy, Margaret. A legacy. Margaret turned the word over in her mind. She'd spent so many years thinking of herself as a cautionary tale. The nurse who couldn't adjust to civilian life, who brought the war home with her in the form of impossible standards and emotional walls. But maybe that wasn't the whole story. Maybe she'd actually been doing exactly what she was supposed to do all along, taking the lessons learned in the worst possible circumstances and using them to prepare others for the worst days they'd hopefully never face. 6 months after Vance's visit, St. Catherine's received accreditation as a Level 1 trauma center, an achievement the hospital had been working toward for years, but had never quite reached. The accreditation team specifically cited the hospital's exceptional training protocols and clinical standards in their report. At the celebration, Mr. Harrison gave a speech praising the entire staff's dedication and hard work. But then he called Margaret to the front of the room. None of this would have been possible without the standards established by our Director of Clinical Training. Margaret Chen brought excellence to this hospital, and even when we didn't appreciate it, she never wavered. She made us better whether we wanted to be better or not. And I think we owe her our thanks. The applause was genuine and sustained. Jessica and Marcus stood, starting a standing ovation that swept through the room. Dr. Morrison raised his glass in a toast. Even the nurses who'd once mocked her behind her back were on their feet, clapping. Margaret stood there, overwhelmed by the recognition, by the acceptance, by the sense that finally, People understood what she'd been trying to do all along. She thought about giving a speech, but words felt inadequate. So she simply said, "Thank you. All of you, for being willing to learn, for being willing to be better, for caring enough about your patients to meet the standards they deserve." Later that night, as she was leaving the hospital, she found a small group waiting by her car, young nurses from the evening shift, including several she'd trained. "Ms. Chen," one of them said, "we just wanted to say thank you. Really thank you. Not just for teaching us protocols, but for teaching us to care enough to do things right. You've made us better nurses." Margaret felt that unfamiliar warmth in her chest again, the one that came from connection, from being understood, from knowing that her years of difficult work had mattered. "You've made yourselves better nurses," she corrected gently. "I just showed you the tools. You chose to use them. Will you tell us more stories sometime?" Another nurse asked. "About your deployment? We want to understand where all this comes from." Margaret hesitated. She'd spent years keeping those stories locked away, sealed behind walls that kept her functional but isolated. But looking at these young faces, seeing their genuine interest and respect, she realized that maybe sharing the stories wasn't weakness. Maybe it was the final step in transforming trauma into purpose. "Yes," she said finally. "I'll tell you stories. Not all at once. Some of them are difficult to tell. But over time, I'll help you understand where these standards come from, what they cost, why they matter." She smiled. "On one condition, you have to promise to pass them on. Teach the next generation what you're learning now. Make sure the lessons don't get lost," they promised enthusiastically, and Margaret drove home feeling lighter than she had in years. The walls she'd built to survive were still there. She'd always carry the scars of her service, but they had doors in them now. Windows. Ways for light and connection to get through. A year later, Margaret stood in the same conference room where Vance had told her story to the hospital staff. But this time she was the one speaking, and her audience consisted of 20 military, medical personnel preparing for deployment, and 30 civilian nurses, interested in learning combat casualty care. "Welcome to Advanced Combat Medical Training," she began, her voice carrying the same crisp authority it always had. "Over the next 4 weeks, I'm going to teach you protocols that will save lives in the worst circumstances you can imagine. Some of you will deploy to combat zones. Some of you will stay in civilian hospitals. But all of you will face moments when chaos threatens to overwhelm you, when you'll need to function despite fear and uncertainty and impossible pressure." She paused, looking at each face in turn. These protocols aren't just procedures. They're wisdom earned in blood and fire by nurses and medics who came before you. Every standard I teach you exists because someone learned the hard way that it matters. And my job is to pass that wisdom on to you without requiring you to pay the same price for it that we did. She clicked to the next slide, showing a photo of her younger self at Fob Falcon, surrounded by tired but determined medical staff. "This is where I learned that medicine isn't just about knowledge and skill. It's about discipline, character, the ability to maintain standards when everything in you wants to take shortcuts, the courage to do things the right way, even when the easy way is tempting." Another photo appeared, this one of Captain James Martinez, standing beside a row of evacuated casualties, all alive and stabilized. "This is one of my former students. He saved hundreds of lives using the protocols we're about to cover, and his students will save hundreds more. That's the legacy we're building together. A chain of excellence that extends across generations." She looked out at her students, seeing echoes of her younger self in their faces. "Some of you will think I'm too strict, too rigid, too demanding. That's fine. I'd rather you think I'm difficult now than have you realize too late that I should have pushed you harder. Because when you're in the field, facing the worst day of your life, you won't wish I'd been easier on you. You'll be grateful for every technique I drilled into you, every protocol I made you practice until it was automatic, every standard I refused to let you compromise on." A young medic in the front row raised her hand. "Ma'am, what if we fail? What if we do everything right and people still die?" Margaret recognized the question. The same one Carlos Reyes had asked. The same one she'd asked herself countless times. "Then you'll carry that weight, and it will hurt. But you'll also know that you did everything possible, that you gave them every chance. And that knowledge, that certainty that you did your best, will be what allows you to keep going." She smiled slightly. And then you'll get better. You'll learn. You'll make sure that next time you're even more prepared. That's how we honor the ones we lose, by saving the next one. The training session lasted 4 hours, and by the end, her students were exhausted but energized. Several approached her afterward with questions, and Margaret answered each one with patience and thoroughness. This was where she belonged, not isolated and resented, but engaged and respected, teaching others to carry on the work she'd started. That evening, Sarah Vance called. She was planning another visit, bringing with her a documentary crew from the Army Medical Department. They wanted to film Margaret's training program as a model for military-civilian cooperation. "You're becoming famous in certain circles?" Vance said with obvious pride. "The nurse who bridges two worlds, the one who never stopped serving." "I'm just doing what you taught me," Margaret replied, taking the lessons learned in chaos and using them to create order. "No," Vance corrected gently. "You're doing what you taught yourself. I showed you how to survive. You figured out how to transform survival into purpose. That's all you, Margaret." After they hung up, Margaret stood at her window, looking out over the parking lot where she'd once stood feeling isolated and misunderstood. So much had changed. She was still demanding. That would never change. Still insistent on protocols and standards. Still unwilling to compromise on quality. But now people understood why. Now they respected the expertise instead of resenting the demands. She thought about the young nurse she'd been, boarding that transport plane with hope and fear warring in her heart. She thought about the combat nurse she'd become, learning to channel impossible emotions into precise action. She thought about the isolated years that followed, when she'd maintained standards without being able to explain their importance. And she thought about now, teaching, mentoring, building bridges between the military and civilian worlds, creating a legacy that would save lives long after she was gone. It hadn't been an easy journey. She still carried scars, some visible, most not. She still saw the faces of the ones she'd lost. She still woke sometimes from dreams of desert heat and distant explosions, but she'd learned to carry that weight without letting it crush her. She'd learned that the walls she'd built could have doors, that strength and vulnerability weren't opposites, that being strict and being caring were two sides of the same coin. Her phone buzzed with a message from Jessica. "Ms. Chen, I just wanted you to know. I used the triage protocol you taught us today in the ER. Multi-car accident, 5 criticals. Everyone survived. Thank you for teaching me to stay calm in chaos. You literally helped me save lives today." Margaret smiled, feeling that warmth spread through her chest again. This was why she'd endured the mockery, the complaints, the years of being misunderstood. For moments like this, for nurses like Jessica who'd take the protocols and use them to save lives, for the chain of excellence that extended across generations, from her instructors to her students to their students, each link making the next one stronger. She typed back, "You saved those lives, Jessica. I just gave you the tools. You chose to use them well. That's what makes you an excellent nurse." But as she sent the message, she knew the truth was more complex. Yes, Jessica had done the work. But Margaret had given her the foundation, the protocols, the training, the mindset that allowed her to function in chaos. And that foundation had come from Margaret's experiences in the desert, from Colonel Vance's teachings, from all the lessons learned in blood and fire and transformed into wisdom. That was the real legacy, not individual heroism, but the systematic transmission of knowledge that made heroism possible. Every life Jessica saved was a tribute to everyone who taught Margaret. Every student Margaret trained was a living memorial to the soldiers she'd served with. The chain extended backward into history and forward into the future, connecting them all. Margaret turned from the window and began preparing for the next day's training session. There was work to do. There was always work to do. Standards to maintain, protocols to teach, knowledge to pass on. It was demanding work, exacting work. Work that required absolute precision and unwavering commitment. But it was also important work. Meaningful work. Work that saved lives, and trained others to save lives, and created ripples that extended far beyond what she could see or measure. She was still the strict nurse who insisted on perfect technique, still the demanding instructor who accepted nothing less than excellence. Still, the woman shaped by combat into something harder and more resilient than she'd ever imagined she could be. But now she was also something more. A teacher, a mentor, a bridge between worlds. The army nurse who'd learned to share her expertise instead of just enforcing it. The combat veteran who'd found a way to transform trauma into purpose, isolation into connection, rigid standards into living legacy. And that made all the difficult years worth it. So there it is. The story of a nurse who learned that true strength sometimes means being misunderstood, that real compassion can look like strictness, and that the lessons learned in the hardest circumstances can become gifts to those who come after. Margaret Chen's journey from combat nurse to respected trainer wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Not just for her, but for all the lives her students would go on to save. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about the people in your life who push you to be better even when it's uncomfortable, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Maybe you've known someone like Margaret, someone whose high standards seemed harsh until you understood where they came from. Or maybe you've been that person yourself, holding the line when everyone else wanted to compromise. And if you found value in this story, if it changed how you think about the difficult people in your life, or the standards we all sometimes resent, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. There are more stories like this one. Stories about people who transform trauma into purpose, who maintain integrity when it's easier to compromise, who teach difficult lessons because they care too much to do anything else. Thanks for listening. And remember, sometimes the strictest teacher is the one who cares the most.